Hey friends, tonight we're diving into the wonderfully strange world of medieval romance, a time when dating advice involved astrology, pork fat, and sometimes even a duel. If you think modern dating apps are confusing, imagine trying to woo someone when your biggest flirting move was strumming a lute and saying a prayer. Before we get cozy, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy hanging out here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fun seeing who's tuning in from around the world. Alright, lights dimmed? Fan humming in the background? Perfect. Let's settle in. Today, eye contact is supposed to create intimacy. In medieval Europe, it created problems, suspicion, betrothals, or in some cases, lawsuits. Courtship back then often began with a look. Not a casual glance, a perfectly timed, morally acceptable look. Too short and you look disinterested. Too long and congratulations, you'd basically proposed marriage or challenged her father to a duel. Romantic? Sure. Safe? Not at all. The manuals of courtly love advised men to gaze softly yet sincerely, which honestly sounds like an ad for a 14th century cologne. The perfect look was somewhere between, "I deeply admire your embroidery," and "I am not here to conquer your land." But it was tricky. If a lady blushed, a gentleman was supposed to immediately look away, cross himself, and maybe even leave town, just in case. Of course, blushing could mean anything back then: a light breeze, too much wine, or having the plague. The church wasn't thrilled about all this staring, either. Clergy warned that too much eye contact invited temptation, and possibly gout. They encouraged couples to keep their gazes modest, their conversations brief, and their eyes firmly on the floor. Accidentally locking eyes in church? Scandalous. Might as well have eloped. For noblewomen, eye contact was practically a weapon. They were trained to master the courtly look, cool, expressionless, and vaguely bored. A single wandering glance could be read as flirtation, witchcraft, or just bad digestion, and all three could get you in trouble. And yet, despite the risks, people still stole glances across banquet halls, marketplaces, and muddy roads. Lovers wrote poems about looks that lasted half a heartbeat. Troubadours sang ballads about eyes that pierced the soul, which really just meant, "She looked at me slightly longer than was socially acceptable." And yes, there was no deodorant back then, unless you count Panic, Rosemary, or a good strong breeze. But that didn't stop people from trying to smell nice. Medieval dating guides even claimed your romantic success depended on smelling decent. No cologne? No problem. You went straight to your herb garden, your local apothecary, or, if you were desperate, your soup pot. One of the most popular pieces of medieval dating advice for men? Stuff herbs in your clothes. Rosemary, sage, lavender, tuck them into your sleeves or boots so that every time you walked by a lady, you left behind a mysterious floral trail. Did it cover the smell of sweat, leather, and sheep? Absolutely not. But it showed effort, and in the Middle Ages, effort counted for a lot. If you had money to spare, you could go one step further and carry a pomander, a fancy little orb packed with herbs, spices, and sometimes dried oranges. It dangled from a chain on your belt, swinging dramatically as you walked, sending a very clear message: "I bathe, eventually." Women had their own scent strategies. They carried sachets or tucked herbs into their corsets, not just to smell pleasant, but also to keep fleas away. Because nothing kills the mood faster than lice. Some guides even suggested rubbing herbs directly on your skin. Basil for courage, mint for freshness, marjoram for charm. One love manual from the 13th century even claimed that thyme rubbed on the chest would make the heart visible. Symbolic? Maybe. Horrifying? Definitely. Either way, you know someone tried it. Of course, not every smell was romantic. Garlic was a mixed signal. It meant vitality, but also that you smelled like someone who lived in a turnip. And if your breath reeked of beer and pickled fish, that wasn't a romantic disaster, that was just a regular Tuesday. But scent was only half the game. The other half was poetry. In the medieval world, poetry wasn't just an artistic hobby, it was basically the Tinder of its day. And the rules were strict. You weren't supposed to compliment a woman's looks or personality. No, that was too worldly. Instead, you were encouraged to compare her to religious icons, ideally the Virgin Mary. Because nothing says, "I want to court you modestly," like, "You remind me of the Holy Mother of God." Courtly love poems were usually dripping with religious metaphors, partly to keep the church happy and partly to avoid getting excommunicated for being horny in rhyme form. So you'd get verses like, "O Lady, purest of light, thy gaze holier than holy right," which sounds beautiful, until you realize he's comparing her to a baptismal font. This gave rise to an entire genre of confusing romance. One minute you thought you were reading a love letter, the next you were wondering if it was meant for you or for a local monastery. One especially famous poem called The Beloved, My Angel of Chaste Delight, which feels like the medieval equivalent of being left on read. Of course, many nobles didn't even write their own poetry. They hired troubadours, professional love song writers, to do it for them. Their job was to craft verses that balanced on the knife's edge between deeply romantic and legally defensible. The result was 27 stanzas of "I admire your virtue" from a very safe distance. Women occasionally wrote back, and their poetry tended to be more direct. "I admire your courage, your manners, and the fact that you own land," one might write, which, to be fair, is still a solid dating checklist today. But even the perfect love poem wasn't complete until you seasoned it. Yes, medieval love letters were scented, not with perfume, but with spices. Cinnamon, cloves, rose petals, even a sprinkle of nutmeg if you really wanted to impress someone with very sensitive sinuses. This wasn't just for decoration. According to courtly tradition, spices carried symbolic meaning. Cinnamon meant passion, cloves meant devotion, and nutmeg meant, well, probably that you were rich enough to afford nutmeg. Because in the Middle Ages, nothing said, "I love you" like comparing your crush to the Virgin Mary and mailing them a letter that smelled like mulled wine. Cloves meant devotion. Saffron? That was the ultimate flex, so expensive it practically screamed, "I have money. Please notice me." Of course, by the time your carefully scented love letter made it through 3 days of rain, goat traffic, and a sweaty courier's satchel, it mostly smelled like parchment soup. Ambitious lovers often went further, tucking flower petals into their letters, dried violets, marjoram, even crushed rosemary. One particularly unlucky suitor added fennel, which was quickly taken as an insult unless the lady was planning a salad. The wealthy went all out. Entire scrolls were soaked in rose water or musk so that the smell hit the recipient like a perfume-soaked brick. Subtlety was not the goal was full-on nasal assault. Even the wax seals got the aromatic treatment. Seals could be scented with oils, pressed with intricate family crests, and sent off smelling of frankincense, myrrh, and parental pressure. Naturally, some people went too far. There are accounts of letters so heavily spiced that they were mistaken for medicinal recipes, or worse, cursed scrolls. One particularly fragrant poem supposedly attracted mice during delivery. Romance was complicated. Modern dating might involve flowers, chocolates, or a Spotify playlist. Medieval romance, on the other hand, often involved the delivery of a recently deceased woodland creature. To demonstrate bravery, masculinity, and excellent aim, Knights and noblemen would gift their beloveds the spoils of the hunt. A bouquet of roses was nice, sure, but nothing said, "I think about you when I throw spears," like a freshly slain boar's head, still steaming. This wasn't strange, it was encouraged. According to 14th century chivalric tradition, a man's hunting skill was a direct measure of his worthiness as a suitor. If you could chase down a stag, wrestle it to the ground, and present its antlers on a silver platter, you were basically the medieval Ryan Gosling. Ladies were expected to respond with delight, or at least a convincing gasp, even if it was the third bloody rabbit she'd been gifted that week. Some animals carried symbolic meaning. A swan represented purity and grace, assuming it hadn't bitten anyone on the way over, while falcons, the ultimate high-status gift, symbolized nobility and power. Of course, falcons also needed constant training, daily feeding, and had a habit of biting fingers, but hey, romance isn't supposed to be easy. Lower-status suitors made do with smaller offerings, hedgehogs, ferrets, rabbits. One lovesick baker reportedly gifted a duck to a miller's daughter, only for it to escape into her family's well. That relationship, unsurprisingly, did not work out. The absolute peak of medieval wooing, though, was the ceremonial deer presentation. At a banquet in a lady's honor, a knight would present an entire roasted deer, usually accompanied by music, flattery, and about 50 people pretending this wasn't deeply awkward. Of course, this was all dependent on whether the lady actually liked meat. If she didn't, or had a weak stomach, the gesture could backfire spectacularly. Still, in a world without dating apps or cozy cafes, a dead animal wrapped in ribbon was the clearest way to say, "I braved the forest. I risked infection. And I thought of you the whole time." But even if you didn't have a deer to gift, you could still flirt, very carefully. Open flattery was a minefield. Telling a woman she was beautiful? Too forward. Commenting on her lips? Scandalous. Her hair? Dangerous. It was probably hidden under 3 veils, a wimple, and divine protection. So what could you compliment? Her shoes. Yes, shoes were the safest romantic target. Pointed shoes, called poulaines, were the height of fashion, some so long they had to be tied to the wearer's knees to prevent tripping. If a lady could walk gracefully in them without falling into a moat, that was genuinely impressive, and very marriageable. Complimenting her footwear let a man appear respectful, observant, and not immediately lustful. One 13th century etiquette guide even warned, "When first you greet a lady, comment upon her garment or her step, but let not your eyes wander above the ankle, lest you bring shame." Translation: play it safe. Praise her hemline. It worked in reverse, too. Women might comment on a man's boots, especially if they were imported from Florence or, miraculously, didn't smell like dead badger. This was more than small talk, it was a coded signal. Complimenting a woman's shoes meant, "I've noticed you. I think you're elegant. Please decode this before my father marries me off to someone else." And if she smiled back, nodded, or, heaven forbid, complimented your shoes, congratulations. That was basically a marriage proposal. One recorded exchange went, "Your shoes are finely made, and your cloak is well stitched." 2 months later, married. Plus 5 goats and a vineyard as a wedding gift. So yes, in the labyrinth of medieval courtship, the safest, sweetest, and strangest way to say, "I like you," was simply, "Your shoes seem extremely competent." Because even in the Middle Ages, timing was everything. In medieval times, timing was everything. Astrology wasn't just for horoscopes, it was your relationship counselor, your therapist, and sometimes the reason you stayed single. According to several medieval love manuals, yes, they actually existed, The right time to confess your feelings wasn't when the moment felt right, but when the moon was in the correct phase and Mercury wasn't sulking. A waxing moon, the part where it's growing, was the prime time for romance. Growth, luck, new beginnings, perfect for whispering your undying love to the blacksmith's daughter. Ideally, you'd do it while bathed in silver moonlight, holding something poetic like a rose or a moderately injured bird. A waning moon, on the other hand, was a disaster. Anything begun under a shrinking moon was believed to wither away: relationships, friendships, crops, even soup. Get rejected under a waning moon? Medieval astrologers would nod sagely and say, obviously. Some advice got even stricter: avoid the full moon if you're prone to tears, and steer clear of eclipses unless you want your love confession followed by famine, crop failure, or public humiliation. One 14th century monk, who likely hadn't been on a date in decades, even warned that declaring love under a new moon would bring misfortune, tooth rot, and spiritual confusion. Naturally, someone tried it anyway. He was later bitten by a goose. Coincidence? Medieval minds said no. And this wasn't just peasant superstition. Nobles consulted court astrologers before sending love letters, arranging betrothals, or even flirting across a banquet table. Some marriages were delayed for better planetary alignments, the 1300s version of ghosting via star chart. And of course, astrology made a perfect excuse. I do like you, Beatrix, but Saturn is in retrograde, and my heart must obey the cosmos. Honestly, in a world of questionable hygiene, unstable politics, and frequent wild boar attacks, checking the sky before saying, I love you, was probably the sanest thing they did. But medieval lovers didn't just rely on the stars, sometimes they turned to potions. Enter the love potion, the Middle Ages' answer to awkward flirting, rejection, and the eternal question, what if I could just make them like me with soup? These brews were rarely subtle. One popular recipe called for honey, basil, and powdered deer heart, because nothing says romance like organ dust. Other versions threw in rose petals, cinnamon, wine, or something alarming like ashes of burned hair. Some potions were meant to be drunk. Others were dabbed onto clothing. A few were buried under thresholds or hidden in baked goods, which was all well and good until your crush bit into what tasted like rosemary and regret. And then things got weirder. Certain recipes called for graveyard dirt, boiled fingernails, or even black cat fat. No actual cats, please. One 12th century charm suggested whispering a spell over a piece of bread at sunrise and feeding it to your beloved, which, let's be honest, is the kind of thing that gets you cursed today. Oddly enough, these potions weren't just seen as silly superstition. They were taken seriously enough that courts sometimes prosecuted potion makers for bewitching the nobility. One nobleman even claimed he'd been seduced against his will because the woman wore enchanted rosemary. Sure, Harold. Blame the herbs. Most potions didn't work, of course. Many just made people dizzy, nauseous, or mysteriously prone to writing poetry. But belief was powerful. If someone thought they were under a love spell, they often started acting like it. Which, frankly, isn't that different from modern dating after 2 glasses of wine. And when love wasn't handled through moon phases or questionable soup, it was handled through duels. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart, it was a matter of honor, bruised egos, and occasionally, dented helmets. If another man so much as glanced at your beloved for half a second too long, etiquette demanded one of 2 responses. Write a passive-aggressive poem. Challenge him to a duel. Most chose option 2. Faster results. More blood. Considerably more drama. The chivalric code of knights demanded that a man defend his lady's honor, even if the lady had no idea anything had happened, even if she didn't want defending, even if she was the one who made eye contact first. None of that mattered. You drew your sword, tossed down a glove, and prepared to bleed for love. Yes, this actually happened. Picture a medieval knight dramatically pointing his sword at another man and declaring, "Sir, you have insulted my lady's virtue with thine eyes. Prepare thy spleen." Duels could be anything from full-on jousts with horses and lances to less glamorous, but equally petty, sword fights or angry staring contests. The goal wasn't always to kill, it was to prove you cared enough to risk tetanus. Some duels were official, with referees and cheering crowds, while others ended in the village fountain with at least one man yelling, "I regret nothing." For women, this was equal parts flattering and exhausting. You couldn't stroll through a market without sparking a small-scale battle over your ribbon. Some ladies tried to avoid drama by claiming bad eyesight. "Oh no, I was looking at the cabbage cart, not that squire's jawline." Not every duel was about romance. Some were over land, politics, or because someone mispronounced someone else's name. But when love was involved, the stakes were higher. The prize? A vaguely impressed noblewoman and a slim chance at her hand in marriage. If your crush seemed a little too interested in someone else, the medieval solution was simple: challenge, clash, bleed slightly, win her affection. Love and war weren't metaphors back then, they were a matching set. If you really wanted to show devotion, you didn't buy flowers or write poetry. You strapped on 40 pounds of armor, pinned her favorite ribbon to your chest, and went charging into battle. This was called wearing her colors, and it was surprisingly common. Knights would display a lady's token, maybe a handkerchief, a veil, or a scrap of lace, before heading to war or a joust. It was both romantic and practical. The message was clear: I fight for her honor. Also, I look fantastic in lilac. Knights who displayed a lady's token could earn prestige, patronage, and maybe a freshly baked pie upon returning home. But there was a catch: you had to look dignified, even if the token was embroidered with daisies or smelled like her laundry. Some men went all out, attaching entire sleeves from their lady's gown to their armor, often snagging them on weapons mid-battle. One unfortunate knight tied a garter to his helmet, only for it to slip down mid-joust and cause a minor concussion. Color choice was symbolic, too: red for passion, blue for loyalty, green for complicated situations. In some regions, green meant hope and fertility; in others, it hinted your lady might be seeing other knights. Risky. Critics mocked this tradition, saying knights looked like walking laundry racks. Unsurprisingly, those critics rarely had dates. Some ladies embroidered blessings or messages into their tokens, with notes like "Victory to my champion" or "Try not to bleed out again." Practical, heartfelt, and just a little bit bossy. To outsiders, it might have looked ridiculous: hardened warriors charging into battle with lace ribbons fluttering behind them, but for the knights, it was a badge of pride. A very public way of saying, "I care about someone, and I'm not afraid to get mildly impaled about it." Romance didn't stop at tournaments. If you liked someone, you didn't text them or slip into their DMs, you stood outside their window at night and sang. Serenading was considered one of the noblest gestures a suitor could perform, second only to not dying in battle. A well-sung ballad could win hearts, earn smiles, and maybe get you a wave the next time she passed you at church. The key word here is well-sung. Most suitors weren't professional musicians. They had lutes, those awkward pear-shaped instruments that always looked slightly broken, but very little idea how to play them. Medieval songs were more chant-like than catchy, and lyrics often revolved around stars, lilies, and eternal devotion. Some sang in Latin to sound intellectual, French to sound wealthy, or a regional dialect that sounded like someone choking on bread. One famous case tells of a baker's son in ruin who tried a moonlit serenade, his voice cracked by verse 2, his instrument snapped by verse 3. Ladies were expected to listen quietly, maybe peek through shutters, but never laugh, even if the performance sounded like a goat in distress. They were supposed to drop a token of encouragement, like a flower, ribbon, or at least a polite cough. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it earned the singer a bucket of chamber pot water dumped from above, an early form of negative review. Still, there was something heroic about singing your feelings to the night, even if your only audience was an owl and a bored cat. And then there was the medieval skincare routine, herbs. Love guides claimed that smelling good was key to finding a partner, so men were advised to rub crushed basil, rosemary, or marjoram on their faces to appear more attractive. Women made herbal tonics and dabbed them like 14th century toner. The results were mixed. Imagine arriving at a feast with parsley oil dripping down your chin and thyme stuck in your eyebrow. Rich nobles had access to rosewater, saffron, and sandalwood, luxury scents that said, "I definitely don't wrestle pigs." The poor made do with garlic or onions, which may explain why some relationships never got past the first look. Apothecaries sold love salves, secret blends of mashed herbs that promised to make you irresistible. Results varied. Side effects included sneezing, dizziness, and attracting goats. And when words and smells failed, people turned to flowers, the original emojis. Medieval lovers used blooms as secret codes. Red roses for love, violets for modesty, daisies for innocence. A single flower could carry more meaning than an entire scroll of bad poetry, and far fewer spelling errors. Lilies meant purity. Lavender meant, "I'd like to woo you, but let's not get excommunicated over it." Bouquets in the Middle Ages weren't just pretty, they were puzzles. Each flower was a carefully chosen word in a secret love letter written in petals and social anxiety. Want to express desire while keeping your reputation intact? Send columbine for foolishness mixed with carnations for fascination. Need to apologize for flirting with her sister at the last feast? Include white hyacinth, medieval for "sorry I made a mess." Want to break up without causing a duel? Yellow carnations, the floral equivalent of "it's not you, it's me." This wasn't just a quirky pastime. Entire manuscripts catalogued the meanings of herbs and flowers, turning castle gardens into emotional minefields. Walk through the courtyard with a daisy tucked in your belt and you were publicly announcing your innocence. Leave a thistle on someone's doorstep and you were basically saying, "I'd rather marry a goat." Women, of course, responded in kind. A returned flower meant interest. A flower tossed in the nearest ditch meant a hard no. One particularly savage noblewoman once replied to a suitor's bouquet with a dead weed and a note reading, "I prefer monks." Brutal. And if you were truly unlucky, your carefully crafted bouquet might be eaten by the family goat before it reached its intended target. Even public events became stages for this botanical drama. At tournaments, knights sometimes wore bouquets or wreaths gifted by ladies, not just as decoration, but as bold statements of allegiance. Nothing said, "I'm taken," like charging across the jousting field with roses pinned to your chest while swinging a mace. And when the dancing started, romance became even riskier. Courtly dancing was less like the waltz and more like competitive walking. Forget dips and spins, medieval dances were slow, deliberate, and mostly involved gliding politely in a line while trying not to look too excited. The bass dance, literally low dance, was all about graceful footwork and keeping your gaze respectful, which was difficult when the briefest brush of fingertips could be interpreted as a marriage proposal. Dances were full of hidden messages. A long gaze during a turn might say, "I admire you." A misstep might say, "I am unworthy of your affection." and stomping on her foot? That said everything, and usually ended any future correspondence. Village dances were a little looser but still closely monitored by chaperones who treated every extra twirl like a federal offense. Music came from live minstrels, bagpipes, or whatever drum-like object was lying around. Keeping in time was essential. Trip over the noblewoman's hem and you could end up fined, flogged, or at the very least, banned from future dances. Medieval love guides even advised paying attention to your partner's dancing style. Graceful and elegant meant they were a good match. Wild and unpredictable meant they were passionate but risky. Flailing like a goose on fire? Probably not marriage material. But even if you wrote the poems, sang the songs, wore her colors, and survived the jousts, you weren't done yet. You still had to defeat the final boss of medieval romance, her family. Winning a woman's heart was only half the battle. The other half was convincing her parents, especially her father, that you were sane, wealthy, and not currently excommunicated. Courtship often came down to land negotiations, dowries, and tense dinners where everyone pretended they weren't basically merging two small fiefdoms. Families looked for stability, land, livestock, and at least one working tooth. Symbolic gifts were common: grain, carved spoons, cloaks, or if you really wanted to impress, a whole pig. The wealthiest suitors might present multiple pigs, gold coins, or even a monk to vouch for their intentions. In villages, the process could be more informal but no less intimidating. A father might judge you by your boots, your handshake, or your ability to wrestle his neighbor over a property line. Mothers could be worse, testing your patience with riddles, church sermons, and endless meals. One chronicle even records a woman who only approved of suitors who could churn butter. If, after all this, the family approved, you might get a single nod. That nod was your green light, the medieval equivalent of being Facebook official. If a Viking funeral wasn't done properly, the consequences could be chilling. A restless spirit might return, and no one wanted that. In the Viking mind, death wasn't simply an ending. It was a crossing. But a poorly handled death could haunt the living, quite literally. When we picture Viking funerals today, we imagine a longship aflame, drifting into a blazing sunset. Hollywood might exaggerate, but that image isn't pure fantasy, it's rooted in real Norse tradition. To the Vikings, a ship wasn't just a tool of conquest or trade. It was a sacred vessel, a bridge between worlds. In life, it carried warriors to battle and merchants to distant shores. In death, it carried the soul across the threshold into the next realm. So when a person of high status died, a chieftain, a great warrior, a noblewoman, their send-off often involved a ship, one way or another. Sometimes, a full vessel was dragged ashore, placed in a trench shaped like a ship, and turned into a tomb. The dead were laid inside, dressed in their finest, surrounded by swords, shields, jewelry, food, and animals, even, in some cases, slaves or thralls meant to serve them in the afterlife. The ship would then be covered with stones and earth, forming a great mound that stood as a monument to the dead. Many of these burial mounds, like the famous Osberg and Gokstad ships, have been found perfectly preserved, time capsules of the Viking world. And yes, there was fire. The iconic flaming ship wasn't just for drama. In some coastal or island communities, the body and grave goods were placed aboard a smaller boat, pushed into the water, and set ablaze with tar and pitch. The fire had purpose. It purified the soul, kept evil spirits at bay, and destroyed the vessel, making sure it would never be used again. This was a one-way journey. But ships were expensive. Not everyone could afford such a spectacular farewell. Most Vikings were buried more simply, in shallow graves with modest offerings, yet the image of the ship remained the ultimate symbol of a noble death. While ship burials are the most cinematic, cremation was actually the most common Viking funeral practice, especially early in the Viking Age. And the Norse never did anything halfway. Their pyres were immense, designed not only to burn the body but to transform it. Fire, to the Vikings, was more than destruction. It was purification, a messenger to the gods. As the pyre roared, they believed the smoke carried the spirit skyward, to Odin's hall, to Freyja's fields, or wherever fate decreed. The body would be placed on the pyre with care, dressed in fine clothes, surrounded by grave goods, weapons for warriors, jewelry for noblewomen, tools, food, even pets. These objects weren't symbolic gestures, they were practical. You wouldn't go raiding without a sword, so why would you face the afterlife empty-handed? The funeral was an event, part mourning, part celebration. Family and friends might feast for days, sharing stories of the deceased while skalds recited verses in their honor. Animal sacrifices, horses, dogs, were sometimes made to accompany the dead on their journey. When the pyre finally burned low, the ashes and bone fragments were gathered with care. They might be buried in urns, scattered in sacred places, or placed beneath runestones marking the grave for future generations. For the Norse, this wasn't morbid. It was beautiful. A Viking funeral was a roaring, defiant exit, a soul riding the smoke toward the gods, a statement to the living that this life had mattered. Grave goods were far more than keepsakes. They were tools, provisions, and symbols meant to equip the dead for whatever trials awaited beyond death. For warriors, this often meant weapons, their finest sword or axe, a strong shield, sometimes even a full suit of armor. But these weapons weren't always meant to be used again. Many were deliberately bent or broken before burial, a symbolic killing of the weapon so it could journey with the soul, and a clever way to discourage grave robbers. Wealthy Vikings were buried with treasures, coins, drinking horns, imported silks, and fine Frankish jewelry. Women were often laid to rest with keys, symbols of household authority, brooches, spindle whorls, and other domestic tools. Children might be buried with toys, small animals, or charms for protection. But the most striking grave goods were the large ones: horses, dogs, falcons, even entire boats. And in the highest-ranking burials, human sacrifices could occur. Slaves or servants, often drugged or ritually killed, were believed to accompany their master into the afterlife, continuing their service beyond death. Not all grave goods were practical. Some were deeply symbolic: a broken comb for cleanliness, a fishing hook for survival, a hammer invoking Thor's protection. These choices were intimate, deliberate, and spiritual. Customs varied by region. Sweden favored elaborate boat graves, while Iceland's scarce resources led to simpler burials. In many settlements, pagan rites blended with early Christian symbols as conversion slowly spread. These burials weren't just about the dead, they told a story for the living. They revealed who a person had been, what they valued, how they died, and how they wished to be remembered. To the Norse, a well-prepared grave was not a morbid ritual but an ultimate sign of respect, a statement of worth and, perhaps, a passport to Valhalla. A Viking funeral was not a quiet affair. It was a major event, often lasting several days, filled with ritual, symbolism, and drama. The ceremonies began with the preparation of the body. The deceased would be washed, dressed in their finest clothes, and sometimes given a mask or makeup to preserve their appearance. This sacred task usually fell to women, spiritual caretakers, professional mourners, or priestesses known as vola, who guided the dead toward the next world. Then came the gathering. Family, friends, warriors, and sometimes entire villages assembled to honor the deceased. At wealthy funerals, guests traveled from afar. These were communal moments, part mourning, part celebration, more like a solemn feast with a touch of competitive drinking. A key figure in these ceremonies was the sacrificer, a priest, chieftain, or shaman, who conducted the rites. This could involve blood offerings, usually animals but occasionally humans. Horses and dogs were common sacrifices, believed to accompany their master into the next life. In rare, high-status funerals, slaves were given intoxicants, ritually strangled or stabbed, and placed beside their master as a final act of loyalty or domination. Music and poetry were essential. Skalds, the Viking poets, recited the deeds of the dead, their battles, voyages, and acts of generosity. These performances didn't just entertain, they immortalized the person's legacy for the living and perhaps even for the gods. Finally came the climax, the burial or cremation. Whether the body was laid in a ship, placed under a mound, or burned on a towering pyre, this was the emotional peak. As flames roared or earth fell, mourners shouted farewells, tossed in final tokens, or raised their drinking horns in one last toast. The funeral ended with a great feast, meat, mead, and merriment shared in the name of the dead. It wasn't just a celebration but a reaffirmation of community ties, a way to begin life anew without the deceased while ensuring their memory remained. Perhaps the most haunting element of Viking funerals was human sacrifice. It wasn't common, but when it happened, it left a lasting impression. Norse belief held that the afterlife mirrored life, so a powerful chieftain would want his companions, guards, and concubines to join him. The most detailed account comes from Ahmed ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat, who described a funeral along the Volga River. He wrote of a slave girl who volunteered, or was chosen, to follow her master. After days of ritual preparation, intoxication, and ceremonial parading, she was strangled and stabbed before being laid beside him on a burning ship. To us, it is disturbing. To the Vikings, it was sacred, perhaps even honorable. Yet it also reflected the brutal power dynamics of the age. Not all sacrifices were human, animal offerings were far more common and far less grim. Horses, dogs, and oxen symbolized strength, loyalty, and status, the perfect companions for the next world. As Christianity spread across Scandinavia, human sacrifice became increasingly rare. Kings seeking alliances with Christian Europe outlawed the practice, and by the 11th century, it had largely disappeared. Still, these rituals remind us that Viking culture, for all its poetry, artistry, and fierce honor, was also marked by blood, power, and the belief that death was just the beginning of another journey. In death, the Viking elite didn't just take their treasures, they took people with them, willing or not. A Viking funeral was never merely a goodbye, it was a spectacle designed to impress both gods and mortals. And if the cremation pyre or burning ship was the climax, the burial mound was the final statement, the ultimate mic drop. These towering earthen monuments, called hauga, dotted the Norse landscape like scars of memory. They were not just graves but architectural declarations, visible from fjords, valleys, and roads, silent proclamations that someone important had lived, died, and demanded to be remembered. Building a mound was an art form. Location was everything. A burial mound by the sea spoke of a chieftain whose power came from the waves. One on a hilltop claimed the valley below for generations to come. Sometimes, old mounds were reused, tying a new death to ancestral memory and reinforcing spiritual lineage. Inside, the body was placed in a wooden chamber, a stone-lined pit, or a ship, surrounded by goods for the afterlife, weapons, textiles, tools, even furniture. Then came the mound itself, a carefully constructed dome of earth and stone, sometimes ringed with standing stones in ship-like formations or topped with carved poles meant to guide the spirit skyward, or warn grave robbers to stay away. But mounds were more than funerary art. They were political. A chieftain's mound was a message: I still rule this land, even from the grave. Local communities gathered at these sites for oaths, feasts, and seasonal rites. The dead became part of the land's spiritual geography. Even today, these grassy mounds remain scattered across Scandinavia, some untouched, others excavated to reveal haunting treasures, shields, weapons, textiles, and bones. They remind us that for the Vikings, immortality was not just a matter of faith but of being seen and remembered. And Viking funerals were not solely a masculine affair. For all the blood-soaked sagas about warriors and kings, the graves tell a more complex story about women's roles in Norse life and death. One of the most remarkable finds is the Osberg ship burial, which contained not a king or a warrior, but two women of extraordinary status. Their bodies were laid in a lavish wooden ship alongside silk textiles, carved sleighs, a wagon, and dozens of grave goods. Their identities are unknown, but scholars believe one may have been a Volva, a priestess and seer, a woman who spoke with the gods and read the threads of fate. Women like the Volva held immense spiritual authority. They prepared the dead, washed and dressed the body, performed incantations, and led purification rites. Their presence at funerals gave them a rare and powerful influence, one even warriors respected. Then there were the shield maidens, legendary female fighters who, on rare occasions, were buried with weapons, armor, and riding gear, receiving the same honors as male warriors. The famous Birka warrior grave in Sweden, once thought to hold a man, was revealed by DNA analysis to belong to a woman. Her burial challenges the idea that martial valor was reserved for men. Not all women, however, were honored. Female slaves and concubines could be sacrificed during the funerals of powerful men, a brutal reminder of the hierarchies that governed Norse society. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ahmed ibn Fadlan recorded a chilling account of such a sacrifice along the Volga River, where a female slave was ritualistically killed to accompany her master into the afterlife. These rites reveal a society that was both patriarchal and strangely flexible. Women could be mourners, officiants, warriors, victims, or venerated dead in their own right. Their graves speak of power, tragedy, and reverence all at once. For centuries, Viking funerals burned brightly, literally and symbolically, but by the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the flames began to fade. Not because the Norse lost their taste for ritual, but because a new power was reshaping their world: Christianity. Christianity brought a radically different vision of death. No longer were there many possible afterlives, Valhalla, Helheim, Folkvanga, but only heaven or hell, salvation or damnation. Fire, once a sacred purifier, was now a symbol of punishment. Cremation was condemned. Bodies were to be buried whole, facing east, awaiting resurrection. The conversion of Viking kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway accelerated this transformation. For them, Christianity was as much a political strategy as a spiritual one, a way to gain alliances with Christian Europe, harness the literacy of monks, and consolidate power under a single faith. Gradually, the old ways were outlawed. Ship burials ceased. Human and animal sacrifices were banned. The Vola were silenced, or recast as witches in Christian law. Pagan mounds were abandoned, plundered, or built over with churches. Yet the transition was neither fast nor complete. In remote places like Iceland, ship burials and mound building persisted in secret well into the 12th century. Some families hedged their bets, burying their loved ones with both Christian crosses and pagan grave goods, just in case. By the end of the Viking Age, the roaring pyres and blazing longships were gone. Wooden crosses and quiet churchyards replaced the fire and smoke. But the echoes remain. Burial mounds still rise from the Scandinavian earth. The names of Odin, Freya, and Valhalla still resonate in our stories. And every time we imagine a flaming ship setting sail into the night, we remember a people who faced death with defiance, with fire, steel, and songs carried by the wind. It allowed its wearer to speak, eat, and move through the world undetected. In fact, during certain political assemblies, wearing a border was not just tradition but law, a requirement meant to ensure anonymity in votes and debates. Venice took secrecy seriously. The mask was more than a disguise, it was a mirror, reflecting the paradoxes of Venetian life. This was a city of staggering wealth but deep secrecy, of strict morality yet quiet decadence, of rigid hierarchy yet obsession with appearances. Venice was ruled by the shadowy Council of Ten, a governing body notorious for its spies, secret trials, and quiet punishments. In such a city, hiding one's face became both a defense and a form of play. By the late Middle Ages, masks were no longer mere accessories, they were essential to Venetian identity. They gave citizens freedom to flirt, conspire, gossip, rebel, or confess without fear. And in a city built on illusions, floating palaces, labyrinthine canals, and glittering facades, what better symbol could there be than a face that wasn't truly yours? During Carnival, this illusion became total. The city transformed into one vast stage, every alley and piazza alive with theater. For weeks before Lent, Venice surrendered to spectacle, music, laughter, and carefully orchestrated chaos. The rigid social order, hierarchy, etiquette, the watchful eye of the church, collapsed beneath a tide of masks, feasts, and forbidden pleasures. The Carnevale di Venezia was first officially recognized in 1296, when the Venetian Senate declared it a public holiday. Its roots, however, likely stretched back to pagan festivals such as Saturnalia, where roles were reversed and order gleefully subverted. By the Renaissance, it had become Europe's most dazzling festival, drawing nobles, artists, and fortune seekers from across the continent. Masked balls lit up palaces with candlelight and music. Jugglers and fire-breathers performed in the streets. Gondolas glided along the Grand Canal, strung with lanterns, carrying lovers, spies, and strangers toward intrigue. The air was rich with the smell of roasted chestnuts, wine, perfume, and possibility. But Carnival was more than mere indulgence. It was a social release valve. For a society so bound by decorum and surveillance, Carnival offered a sanctioned period of mischief, satire, and rebellion. Lovers met, grievances were mocked in song or pantomime, and ordinary Venetians could, for a time, feel free of consequence. Even the clergy, who often condemned Carnival's excesses, were rumored to participate, just with subtler disguises. The ruling elite tolerated it all for a reason. Carnival kept the city stable. It was not revolution, it was controlled chaos, a safety valve that let the people burn off restlessness before returning to obedience. Of all the masks, none held as much weight as the border. Its white, expressionless surface, sharp angles, and blank stare gave it an unsettling neutrality. Unlike the ornate, feathered masks of later centuries, the border was practical, almost militaristic. Its design jutted outward, allowing the wearer to speak, eat, and drink without ever taking it off. Worn with a black silk cloak, the tabaro, and a tricorn hat, it rendered every man who wore it indistinguishable from the next. The border was as much a political tool as a social one. In assemblies and councils, it created a kind of democracy by disguise. Nobles and commoners alike were meant to appear equal, their voices disembodied, their votes free from bias or retribution. At least in theory. But anonymity cuts both ways. Behind the border, secret deals were struck, lovers met under cover of night, and conspirators plotted. A man in a border could be a senator, a spy, or a seducer, and you would never know until it was too late. Its very blankness made it powerful, unsettling, even dangerous. If the border was the mask of power, the Moretta was the mask of silence. Worn almost exclusively by women, the Moretta was a black velvet oval that covered the entire face, leaving only the eyes visible. But its most curious feature was how it stayed on. There were no straps. Instead, the wearer held it in place by biting down on a small button or bit inside the mask. This meant the Moretta rendered a woman completely mute. If she wished to speak, the mask would fall away. And that, paradoxically, was its power. In a society that both feared and fetishized women's voices, this mask turned silence into seduction. The woman in the Moretta became an enigma, elegant, untouchable, unreadable. Her muteness forced men to project their own fantasies, fears, and desires onto her. It was at once a symbol of constraint and a weapon of control, allowing Venetian women to move through public life veiled in an aura of mystery and dominance. Both masks, the Borta and the Moretta, reveal the strange genius of Venetian culture. They weren't simply disguises, they were instruments of theater, politics, and power. To wear one was to step into a ritual, to play a role, to temporarily escape yourself, or become something more dangerous than yourself. Even today, when tourists don them for a photograph on the Piazza San Marco, they echo the city's past, a world where identity was fluid, rules were meant to be bent, and freedom came in the shape of a blank face under a black tricorn hat. Women attending mass, visiting convents, or moving through secret associations often wore the Moretta to conceal their identities. Courtesans relied on it to mingle with powerful clients without fear of scandal. In a society where a single rumor could ruin a woman's reputation, the Moretta offered protection, or, at times, plausible deniability. Yet the mask also symbolized a paradox. It granted freedom while enforcing silence. Women could navigate male-dominated spaces, yet their voices were literally bound. Independence and objectification coexisted in a single, elegant veil. The Moretta was most fashionable in the 17th and 18th centuries, a peak of Venetian elegance and restraint, before slowly falling out of use. By the time Venice entered decline under Austrian and French rule, and Carnival itself waned, the Moretta had become a relic of another era, one of countless strange, beautiful, and quietly unsettling customs that disappeared with the Republic. Today, it rarely appears in modern carnival celebrations. In its time, however, it was a mask that spoke volumes precisely by saying nothing at all. While some masks served anonymity or political purposes, others sprang from the theatrical world of commedia dell'arte. Traveling troupes brought improvisational performances to life, each stock character defined by a distinctive mask. Over time, these theatrical faces spilled off the stage, influencing carnival fashion and everyday disguise. Commedia was wildly popular from the 16th century onward. Its cast of characters were instantly recognizable. Harlequin, the nimble, patchwork-served trickster with a sly grin. Pantalone, the greedy old merchant with a hooked nose and furrowed brow. Illinois Dottore, the pompous, long-winded doctor who healed no one. Columbina, the clever maid, who needed no mask, her expressive face was her weapon. These figures exaggerated traits everyone recognized: lust, greed, ignorance, cunning. Improvisation allowed actors to tailor performances to local gossip, politics, and scandals, blending satire, slapstick, and social commentary. During Carnival, these personas escaped the stage entirely. Citizens donned harlequin or pantaloon masks not merely for play, but to mock, flirt, or criticize real people of influence. Masks allowed Venice to joke, reveal, and transgress safely. Even the authorities tolerated it. Who could arrest Harlequin? Through this theatrical lens, Venice became one vast stage. Every masked face was a character. Carnival was art, defiance, and liberation rolled into one. It allowed Venetians to speak dangerous truths, all while concealing their identities, wearing lies to reveal deeper truths. Yet Venice was not merely a city of play. It was a deeply Catholic republic, filled with churches, monasteries, and devout citizens. The church's relationship with masks was fraught. Initially, Carnival was tolerated, even encouraged. Masks let people indulge before 40 days of fasting and penitence. But as centuries passed, anxieties grew. Anonymity fueled affairs, bribery, theft, and heresy. Priests scolded, issued edicts, and forbade masks in churches, convents, and holy spaces. Yet enforcement was sporadic. Even bishops held masked balls. Venetian society excelled at turning a blind eye when it suited politics or profit. Occasionally, authorities cracked down. During plagues, masks were banned to prevent disease or dangerous gatherings. But, like Carnival itself, the bans never lasted. The mask always returned, resilient as the city itself. By the 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas spread and Venice's power waned, the church's influence eroded. Carnival grew more secular, more decadent, less apologetic. Religious authority could lecture, condemn, and restrict, but it could never fully unmask Venice. The city's soul remained half shadow, half grace. For centuries, Venetian masks had ruled the streets, symbols of liberty, subversion, and sensuality. Yet no empire lasts forever. By the late 18th century, the Republic of Venice faced its most formidable adversary, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1797, after more than a millennium of independence, Venice fell to the French. The Serenissima, the most serene republic, was dissolved. Its ceremonies, symbols, and secrets were dismantled with military precision. Carnival, and the masks that defined it, were among the first casualties. Napoleon and his successors viewed masks not as art, but as instruments of disorder, vice, and potential rebellion. What Venetians saw as playful masquerade, the occupiers saw as a threat. Masks, once worn by every class, were suddenly illegal except for official theatrical performances. Overnight, the vibrant chaos of Venice gave way to surveillance and silence. The Mascherie, the Guild of Mask Makers, were driven into obscurity, some adapted to theatre props, others simply vanished. It was more than a costume ban, it was the end of a way of life. For centuries, Venetian masks allowed citizens to critique their leaders, cross social lines, and indulge in secret selves. Without them, Venice felt exposed, constrained, its theatrical soul stripped bare. The 19th century brought foreign rulers, Austrians more than Italians, and with them, stricter regulations. Carnival became a ghost, celebrated quietly in hidden rooms or preserved only on the stage. The grand masked balls, once graced by kings and composers, vanished. The streets that had hosted elaborate parades fell silent. For nearly 2 centuries, the masks of Venice slept, but they did not die. By the late 20th century, a cultural revival fueled by tourism breathed new life into the carnival. Masks returned, not as tools of rebellion, but as works of art, elegant, theatrical, and steeped in nostalgia. Even when banned, they had merely waited, patiently behind the curtain. In 1979, Venice officially reinstated the carnival, ushering in a spectacular rebirth. The focus had shifted. Masks were no longer instruments of political subterfuge or clandestine indulgence. They were symbols of art, heritage, and pageantry. Streets became theaters. Costumed figures in elaborate 18th-century dress glided through the mist, as gondolas sparkled beneath fireworks. Piazza San Marco thrummed with classical music, acrobats, and masquerade balls now designed for the camera lens rather than anonymity. The masks themselves evolved into objects of craftsmanship and spectacle. The ancient guild of masquerie revived, producing pieces in papier-mâché, ceramic, leather, and glass. No two masks were alike, each a miniature masterpiece, decorated with glittering feathers, gold leaf, jewels, and intricate filigree. Familiar designs endured, the full-faced volto, echoing the historic bauta, the half-masked colombina, lavishly adorned, and fantastical creations inspired by animals, mythology, or surreal imagination. Even the commedia dell'arte characters returned, Harlequin, Pantalone, and Illinois Dottore, now parading for photographs rather than satire. Yet the new carnival differed from the old republic's dangerous, unpredictable masquerade. It was safe, curated, and Monetized. Visitors far outnumbered locals. Costumes were rented, events ticketed, and the once secret masks now proudly shared on social media. Still, for a few weeks each year, Venice remembered how to be someone else, how to move unseen beneath a mask, how to see without being seen. Even in the age of smartphones and street vendors, the old Venetian spell, mystery wrapped in elegance, persisted. Why did Venice, for centuries, hide behind masks? The answer is profoundly human. Masks offered liberation from assigned identity. In a society governed by birth, class, gender, and obligation, the mask allowed reinvention. Behind it, a merchant could be a rogue. A nun could flirt. A noble could confess weakness. A man could become a woman could become myth. The mask did not erase identity, it created a new one. Masks were more than fabric and plaster, they were psychological instruments, letting people explore hidden selves, express forbidden desires, and challenge social norms. They blurred the line between actor and audience, performance and personhood. In Venice, a city of water, illusion, and shifting reflections, such transformations were entirely natural. Even today, the magic endures. In carnival, cosplay, Halloween, or masquerade balls, hiding the face remains potent. Disguise allows us to speak boldly, act freely, and explore facets of ourselves normally suppressed. In Venice, masks offered not just concealment, but freedom. The Venetian mask embodies paradox, democracy and hierarchy, anonymity and spectacle, rebellion and tradition. It is seductive yet unsettling, a shield and a sword. It empowered the oppressed to mock the powerful and allowed the powerful to sin unseen. In a world increasingly watched and tracked, the mask reminds us of what is being lost: privacy, mystery, and the right to reinvent ourselves without explanation. Next time a Venetian mask glimmers with gold, feathers fluttering in the wind, remember, it is not merely a souvenir. It is a key to a city of shadows, a festival of freedom, and the ever-changing face of human desire. By the early 1860s, Kyoto was no longer a city of serene temples and poetic calm. Beneath its wooden eaves and sacred shrines, political violence simmered. Assassins roamed freely, bodies surfaced in rivers, and every alley echoed with whispers of revolution. The root of the chaos was simple: Japan was splitting in two. After over 2 centuries of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, foreign powers, America, Britain, and France, had forced open Japan's borders. Gunboats shattered the illusion of isolation, and nationalist movements rallied around a single cry: Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Pro-imperial samurai from domains such as CHSH and Satsuma infiltrated Kyoto, seeing the city as the symbolic heart of the nation. Every skirmish, every assassination, became a strike against the shogunate. Meanwhile, the shogunate, based in Edo, modern Tokyo, could only watch as its authority eroded in the capital. To counter the unrest, the shogunate dispatched the Rushigumi, a temporary militia of masterless samurai, ronin, to escort the shogun during his 1863 visit to Kyoto. Yet when the mission ended, 13 of these ronin refused to leave. For them, Kyoto was not merely duty, it was destiny. Backed by the powerful Aizu domain, they formed the nucleus of what would become the Shinsengumi, tasked with patrolling Kyoto and rooting out anti-shogunate agitators. Unlike traditional samurai, these men were not nobles. Many were of humble or disgraced backgrounds. But all shared one thing: absolute loyalty to the shogunate, and an appetite for blood when necessary. Kyoto, once the quiet capital of emperors, became a city under siege. From this turmoil emerged a new force, clad in blue jackets, wielding swords with terrifying precision, the Shinsengumi. The group began as a ragtag band of ronin but quickly evolved into Kyoto's most feared enforcers. Three figures shaped their rise: Serizawa Kamo, Kondazami, and Hijikata Toshis. Serizawa, violent and unpredictable, threatened the fledgling corps with his reckless brawls and attacks on civilians. Kond, a former sword instructor, and Hijikata, his icy, fanatically loyal lieutenant, saw the danger and acted. In 1863, Serizawa and his loyalists were assassinated in a night raid by their own comrades, a brutal, efficient act that cemented the Shinsengumi's code: absolute loyalty to the shogunate and ruthless discipline. Under Konde's leadership and Hijikata's iron rule, the Shinsengumi enforced strict conduct. Desertion, disobedience, and private duels were punishable by seppuku. Joining meant surrendering your life, your sword, and your name. Their light blue HRY jackets, often adorned with white stripes, became a symbol of fear and authority. Kyoto citizens knew that wherever those jackets appeared, violence was near. But the Shinsengumi were more than enforcers, they were samurai idealists, the last guardians of a fading era. While many warriors abandoned swords for politics or firearms, they clung to bushido, discipline, and martial excellence. The streets of Kyoto trembled under their presence, as assassins were hunted and conspirators interrogated or executed. Their defining moment came during the Aikdare incident of 1864. Rumors swirled that pro-imperial samurai planned to set Kyoto ablaze and abduct officials. Kond led 10 men, with Hijikata bringing reinforcements, into the Aikdare Inn. Outnumbered but prepared, the Shinsengumi unleashed a ferocious surprise attack. In a tight space lit only by oil lamps, swords flashed, walls splintered, tatami mats soaked in blood. By night's end, the plot was crushed, 7 rebels dead, many wounded or captured, and the shogunate's authority reinforced. The cost to the Shinsengumi: 1 member killed, a few wounded, but their fame and fear factor skyrocketed. This night revealed the dual nature of the Shinsengumi: defenders of law, yet assassins under legal protection. For pro-imperial forces, they became monsters. For Kond and Hijikata, it was proof of purpose: they had drawn their swords for order, and they would not sheath them until the shogunate either stood firm or fell. The Shinsengumi's discipline was legendary. Daily drills in the Tenon Rishinawai sword style honed their combat skills for Kyoto's alleys, temples, and crowded streets. Intelligence work was equally vital. Spies disguised as commoners, monks, or merchants shadowed suspects, intercepted messages, and reported plots. When the Shinsengumi struck, they knew everything. Fear, more than steel, became their weapon. Yet even as the Shinsengumi enforced loyalty and order, the world around them was shifting. The Tokugawa shogunate was weakening. Powerful domains like Satsuma and CHSH modernized their armies with Western firearms and tactics. Public opinion shifted. Once heroic enforcers were now feared as brutal oppressors. By 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu's resignation handed power to the emperor, signaling the end of the old order. The Shinsengumi refused to stand down, retreating to Fushimi and preparing for battle against modernized pro-imperial forces. The Boshin War became their final stage. Armed mostly with swords, they faced rifles, cannons, and trained battalions. At the Battle of Toba, Fushimi in January 1868, their courage clashed tragically with technology. Despite valiant charges, the Shinsengumi were overwhelmed. Kyoto was lost, and the Tokugawa loyalists became fugitives. Led by Hijikata, they regrouped in Hokkaido, forming part of the short-lived Republic of Izo, the last stand of Tokugawa loyalists. Kond was captured and executed in April 1868, leaving Hijikata to lead fewer than 100 weary men. On June 20, 1869, at Hakodate, Hijikata fell to a bullet, 34 years old, the demon vice-commander who had survived purges, civil war, and revolution, dying as he had lived, steadfast, unyielding, out of time. With Hijikata's death and the fall of the Republic of Izo, the Shinsengumi ceased to exist. The samurai era ended. Yet their legacy endured. In literature, theater, film, and popular culture, the Shinsengumi became symbols of loyalty, sacrifice, and the samurai spirit. Hijikata Toshi's, Kond Izami, and youthful prodigy Okita remain immortal in Japanese memory, representing men who chose honor over safety, loyalty over convenience, and action over despair. The Shinsengumi were more than a police force. They were men standing at history's crossroads, defenders of a fading code in a rapidly modernizing world. Their blue jackets, their swords, and their unwavering devotion remind us that some ideals are worth fighting for, even when the age itself has passed.